Recording in progress.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. How are you feeling today? Let's get some. How are we feeling today? Are you excited? All right. My name is Peter Blair. I'm an associate professor here at Harvard in the Graduate School of Education, where I'm one of the faculty co-directors of the Harvard Project on Workforce, and I teach a class here on the future of work and the future of education. It is my absolute honor and joy to be your host for today's book launch event, or at least book discussion event, where we have a rock star lineup of folks. So first, I want to remind you that the name of the book is America's Hidden Economic Engines, How Community Colleges Can Drive Shared Prosperity. So this is the book, and we have with us the two authors of the book. So we have Bob Schwartz, who is a faculty emeritus here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and was one of the co-founders of the Harvard Project on Workforce. In fact, Bob was the one who wrote to me into that, and so just someone that I admire a tremendous amount. So please let's welcome Bob. Seated to Bob's left is Rachel Lipson, who is the co-editor of the book that we're going to be discussing today. Rachel was also the founding executive director for the Harvard Project on Workforce when she was here, and is, I think, a triple Harvard student, college, business school, and the Kennedy School, so we're grateful to have Rachel back. At the moment, Rachel is working as a senior policy advisor at the CHIPS program for the U.S. Department of Commerce, so please let's welcome Rachel back to Harvard. And both Bob and Rachel have spoken in my class, so there's a special connection that I have with them too. And we want to extend a very warm welcome to Kenneth Adams, who's the president of LaGuardia College, and he made his way all the way from New York to be here with us in Boston. Prior to being the president of LaGuardia College, Kenneth was the dean of workforce at Bronx Community College, and prior to that, he was in state government. We had a phenomenal prep call, and so I cannot wait for you to hear more from Kenneth. So Kenneth, welcome to Harvard. So just to give you a bit of the run of show, we're gonna segment our hour together in 3 acts. So in the first act, I will be interviewing Bob and Rachel about the book. And then in the second act, I'm going to turn over my hosting privileges to Bob so that he can interview Kenneth about some of the incredible work that he and his team are doing at LaGuardia College. And following that, we're going to have a time for Q&A. And so I'm going to do my best to make sure and keep us on time. So welcome again, and I look forward to the discussion with our terrific panelists and also the excellent Q&A afterwards. So please feel free to make notes. I also want to mention, too, that there are going to be some books afterwards, I think, that are going to be for sale, so I want to encourage you to think about getting those. All right. I'm just going to slide out so I can see your beautiful faces. All right. So Bob and Rachel, we are holding in our hands this book that is an absolute labor of love. First, can you tell us a bit about the origin story of the book? How did the book come to be? Maybe we can kick it off with you first, Bob, and then Rachel.
Well, thank you, Peter. First, it's great to be back in Gutman, where I spent 20-something years. For those who don't know me, I was the school's academic dean for 5 years. I also want to acknowledge that this is a Harvard Education Press book. Rachel and I benefited enormously from the wonderful support and editing of the then editor-in-chief, Jane Farnoli, and we have had nothing but very strong support from Jess Fiorello, the press director, and her team over there. And this, I should say, this is the 9th book in a series on work and learning that my wife, Nancy Hoffman, and I have been curating for the press since 2017. The book, this is the 2nd book that really focuses on community colleges. Nancy co-edited a book with a colleague of hers, Michael Collins, a couple of years ago that I have a copy of, called Teaching Students About the World of Work. And it's, again, focused more on the curricular and teaching side of community colleges. This book, for me, I got to community colleges somewhat late in the game for me. I started as a high school teacher and later a high school principal. I've always been interested in transition issues, high school to college, high school to work. When I and a bunch of colleagues at Jobs for the Future launched the Pathways to Prosperity Network in 2012, our idea was to work with states. We had a small group of states we started working with. The network is still going strong 11 years later. or 12 years later now. But our idea was to try to help these states figure out how do we build stronger pathways that start in high school, seamlessly connect to post-secondary education, and particularly to community colleges, that really are designed to get people launched on careers in fields where there's high growth and high mobility, but in fields or jobs that career lines that do not necessarily require a 4-year degree. And, you know, like a lot of other people doing this kind of work, we started with high schools and then figured, you know, once we got programs launched in high schools, we would then go to the community colleges and then go to employers. About 5 years in, we realized we had this backwards, that if you really want to build career pathways for young people, you really need to start on the demand side of the equation. Mm-hmm. You need to start with employers and then map backwards. And once you get that idea in your head, you realize that community colleges are really the key institution. On the one side sit employers, and it's much, much easier to get employers to connect to community colleges for lots of reasons. But on the other side sit high schools. So that was really the kind of aha moment for me. And that led me to begin thinking about, well, what are the characteristics of good community colleges that really are focused on building opportunity structures for their students, whether they're young people or older people? And that's kind of what led me to this book. Rachel had a somewhat different trajectory. She made the discovery about community colleges earlier in her career than I did, so you might want to talk about that.
Yeah, Rachel, would love to hear your story.
You have to push it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Bob. Thank you to the Ed School. It's great to be back. Technically, I'm not an Ed School alum, but a lot of ways, my journey actually began in this building. Little known fact about me, I wrote my undergraduate senior thesis on the connection between social capital and support for public goods spending on education. And I spent a lot of time upstairs in Gutman back in the day. And that was actually, like, in a lot of ways, the kind of like intellectual genesis of my journey to this book. So it's always great to be back here at the Ed School, and I'll echo the thanks to the Ed Press as well for their support. Bob, I think, gave a good preview here that my journey to the book looked a little bit different. Although I started my path interested in education, my first job out of college was in politics. Then I pivoted to economic development. And I came back to the business school and the Kennedy School, really focused on this question of how do we create more good jobs in America, and what would it look like to invest in ways that might kind of reverse the trajectory that we've been on of increasing inequality by geography, by socioeconomic background, by race. And I landed on community colleges from that perspective. Where's a place in this country that if you could make a big public investment has the potential not just to change the lives of individuals, but to kind of reshape the economic trajectory of communities? And to me, there was like no more compelling institution out there than the community college system. So I spent a good part of my graduate school years here starting to focus on community colleges through that lens as that institution that could kind of reverse some of the trajectory that we've been on of some of these disappointing trends where we've seen actually increasing inequality in the U.S. and lack of equality of opportunity. And I spent, when I first met Bob, I was writing a graduate school thesis on California's community college system as an engine for economic mobility, working for the then Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom's team on what would it look like for California to invest in community colleges through that lens. So when I came back to Harvard in 2019 to work with Bob, David Deming, Joe Fuller across the river at the business school around the idea of starting the project on workforce, community colleges were really like the unifying thematic focus that brought us all together. One of the things I think that's great about community colleges that's only as, I'd say, increased over time is that you can really build a big tent movement around community colleges in this country. especially at a time when we're seeing declining trust in higher education and a lot of questions about the role of post-secondary education in our society. Community colleges, I think, still retain an inclusive appeal. And one of the things I think we wanted to achieve with the book was reinforce that message of here is an institution that offers economic promise really for the masses. And there's not one route to a successful sort of ingredients that make a great community college, but actually there's kind of a diversity of solutions that all focus on sort of shared prosperity and economic mobility as that North Star. And so the book, I think, offered us the opportunity to tell that story through a pretty diverse range of institutions across the country in different communities and different economies that look pretty different historically, racially, socioeconomically, by age, by occupation, by all kinds of measures. And our hope was that basically any policymaker in any part of the United States could look at one of these cases and see some kind of blueprint for what utilizing community colleges as that kind of investment vehicle for a more inclusive future could look like. So that's a little bit of my story.
Just add one more thing if I can, Peter. So we, kind of more specifically, Ken and I first met when he was at Bronx Community College and I was doing some work in New York, but then we both were on a small working group put together by a nonprofit organization in DC called Opportunity America. And we met maybe 6 or 8 times over a year to develop a report that appeared in June 2020 called The Indispensable Institution, Reimagining Community College. And that report was a pretty hard-hitting report, focusing a lot on the sort of the workforce side of community colleges. But the report had, these typical kind of sidebars with 2 or 3 paragraphs about promising practices from different institutions. Around the same time, the Aspen Institute has a really strong unit that focuses on community colleges called the College Excellence Unit, and it put out a report focused on the community. It was basically around community college employer relationships, and again, it had these short snippets that would give you, a little glimpse of promising practices. And so one of the motivations for me for doing this book was really being able to show in much more detail, with these detailed case studies, what it is that good community colleges, not only what they do, but how they do it, what their internal policies and practices are. And I should name for the record the 5 community colleges, and more importantly, tell you that the authors were all graduate students here. And so we sit up front and take credit for this book. The bulk of the book was actually written by these wonderful students of ours. The colleges were Nova, Northern Virginia Community College, probably the best known community college in the book, partly because Jill Biden teaches there, and it's in the metro DC area. Pima Community College in Tucson, Arizona. San Jacinto in the Houston region in Texas. Lorain County Community College in Ohio, and Mississippi Gulf Coast in the Biloxi region in Mississippi.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Just as you were talking, both you and Rachel, mentioning the focus on the case studies, the importance of community colleges as being a potential driver for opportunity in the United States, it made me reflect on my own experience as someone who got his start at a community college and then had the privilege to go to places like Duke, Harvard, and Wharton. And I wanted to just do a poll of them. How many of you in here got your start at a community college, or have a parent or a loved one or a friend or neighbor who has gotten a start at a community college, right? And just look around the room. This is about 40% of you. Yeah. So these are really important institutions. And I wanted to kind of just bring you in briefly and say, what is it like for you as someone who worked in state government, now you're working in the college system, to see this kind of scholarship coming out from Harvard saying, we need to put a lot more attention on community colleges. What is that like for you as someone who's working in the educational ecosystem to see this kind of scholarship?
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everybody. It's super helpful. The five colleges that Bob just described, and they're very well profiled in the book, set up really good examples for places like LaGuardia Community College to aim for. You notice we're not in the book. Like, I came here, and we're not even we didn't make the cut. We're not even in the book. I'll talk about LaGuardia later when it's my turn. But
in the next edition.
So there, it really is helpful on two fronts. There's sort of very practical information in the different. And I was talking about a story today. Lorain County Community College is in the news today, in the trade rag. Those of us in the world read, called Community College Daily, for a new program they have in electronics. But so there's some very specific best practices, Peter, in the book that are really, really helpful. We're about to do a new 5-year strategic plan for LaGuardia. And the woman, Kimberly, who is the facilitator of the plan, read the book over the weekend. She emailed me yesterday. I kind of made it require reading because we want to try to really learn from the lessons in the book across those 5 colleges. But the other piece of it is just advocacy. There are 1,200 community colleges, plus or minus, in the country. And we need to do a better job advocating for the sector. And we need scholarly research and great, sort of common fact bases to use to make, it can't be just opinion. It can't be because it sounds good on a bumper sticker. We're all for economic mobility, right? But the book makes this real and fuels or gives us really helpful information and facts for our advocacy, which is really important.
That's awesome. It's so good to see when scholarship can translate into action, and just the fact that your colleague is reading the book and gleaning lessons from it is incredibly powerful. And it speaks to the importance of research, and it also speaks to the importance of the higher educational ecosystem is consisting of many different parts, right? Bob, I want to kick it back to you and say, as you and the team are going and interviewing folks at these community colleges, how did you choose these 5 colleges? And why was it critical for you to focus on places that were success stories? Because oftentimes when we are in the educational sector, people are finger pointing at things that are not working. But you and Rachel have chosen to say, here are 5 successful places. How did you choose them? And why did you choose to focus on success?
The first thing I should say is we did this project on a very fast timeline. We got a grant in late October, early November of 21, and the project was essentially complete by the end of the spring. Remember, we were in COVID, so all of the case study research done by these fabulous student colleagues of ours was done virtually. At the end of the process, actually, we had a little money left over, and Rachel and I had the opportunity to go visit 2 of these places and work with teams there to prepare 8 or 9 minute videos, which we thought would be helpful for people to really get a visual sense of what these institutions are like and what they do on the ground. What we did is a combination of talking to people in the field who are knowledgeable, looking for examples, but also, so we gathered a list of about 20 institutions, and then we developed a kind of rubric with a whole set of criteria that we were looking for. Data around the student population, data around the region they were serving, data around key industries in the region, graduation rates, a lot of data, about as much data as we really could gather around the institutions itself. Then Rachel and I did hour-long interviews. We narrowed, once, obviously for us, we were looking for, as Rachel said, a diverse set of institutions. No 5 institutions can represent the whole field, but our theory was, if we choose wisely, every community college should be able to see one college in this set that they can imagine identifying with that looked enough like their population, et cetera. We then narrowed the field down to 7, did 7 hour-long interviews with a kind of common format to pick our places. The way I came to think about this after the fact, after we'd selected our institutions and really begun working with them, is that what we were looking for were really institutions that were really dual client institutions that understood that, first, obviously, their focus was on learners. And one of the things that's common about these institutions that is in all 5 institutions, and this is fairly common for the field as a whole, at least 70% of their students were part-time. So that meant they really were institutions focused on working learners, not your 18-year-old typical, sort of what we think of as, what we used to think of as the traditional college-age population. So our idea was, yes, they understood who their population was, and they had a kind of laser-like focus on the ultimate goal of economic advancement. They operated on the premise that anyone who walked in their door, whether it was a 19-year-old or a 44-year-old looking for a short-term upskilling or reskilling, that ultimately the goal was economic advancement. And then they understood that in order to be able to achieve that goal, they needed to just build a set of working relationships with key industry leaders in their regions so that they could really be assured not only that they were preparing students for their current economies, but they also positioned themselves to be key players in their sort of regional economic development ecosystem. So the idea was not simply to prepare students for the economy that is, but to have a voice in shaping the economy of the future. So they were being sort of proactive about that. And in Rachel's wonderful chapter at the end, which kind of looks across these cases and draws some lessons, one of the things she points out is that in each case, the leaders were very actively involved in regional economic and workforce development boards. They were chairing the regional workforce boards. They were involved in sector industry organizations like the Manufacturing Association in the greater Cleveland area, or depending on what the sectors were. And that working really in a deliberate way to build their programs in partnership with employers was the other signature. And these two, when I say dual client, it really means these two sides of their work kind of reinforced one another, if you will. So that was ultimately that was the key thing we were looking for.
So let me touch on that leadership point a bit more and bring you in, Rachel. So you looked at the summary of what are some of the key lessons that we could glean from that. At the moment now, you sit at the Department of Commerce, the CHIPS Act, billions of dollars. We're thinking it's on everybody's mind, generative AI, the tech race. Where's America's positioning in this? Can you speak to the potential role that community colleges can play in helping the U.S. to remain competitive in the workforce of the future? Perhaps drawing on the lesson from one of the colleges that was very successful at thinking about how to integrate tech training into their curriculum. And yeah, I'd love for you to kind of tie in your current role and also your scholarly role within this book as we think about the future of work.
It's just a softball, Peter.
Well, I mean,
I wasn't on the script. No, happy to share some.
We have you here. It's on everybody's mind, right?
I will. Happy to answer it. I should say, though, given that question, that I'm appearing in my personal capacity, so anything I say right now does not represent the views of the U.S. Department of Commerce or the federal government. So just to make our lawyers happy. So I'll talk about my experience with the book, but obviously I'm one person, so my experiences over time now will color how I'm viewing the state of the world. A few thoughts. One, Bob mentioned this. How do you, as an educational institution, not just be responsive to where things are and actually try to be part of the looking ahead? It's a big task and a big challenge, but it's been one of the most important questions I think that I've been focused on in my trajectory over the last decade or so working in this space, because I found it wholly unsatisfying when I was sitting in your seats when people were saying, well, just align to labor market demand. This is what you'll hear a lot in workforce development. And what about if you're in a community where the jobs that are there are not good jobs, or especially if there aren't a lot of good jobs available if you don't have a four-year degree? Do you just train people for like bad jobs? And that's what aligning to labor market demand means. Or if you're in a depressed area where there aren't jobs at all, how do you, as an educational institution, sustain yourself if you're not part of that kind of net productivity solution and job creation solution? So that's kind of like the why, and I think it's actually an impetus for institutions like community colleges to be at the table as part of the solution, because if they just sit and wait for kind of like the market to do its work, those good jobs might not be there. So I think part of the challenge that the book poses to community college leaders is, what's your role in being part of that solution? And there's a few different sort of ways that the cases can show how you come at that problem. A place like Nova, I think, is an interesting story because I live now in DC. Sorry, Boston. This is a region that's been doing overall quite well over the last few decades and is growing IT jobs, but also like data centers. Places like Amazon have been growing exponentially. And building a lot of jobs that are what you might call like the future of the skilled technical workforce. And a lot of those jobs, if you break down the tasks, do not necessarily require a 4-year degree at all. But I think what you'll see in the case is that the leadership of the school encountered a sort of like a mindset shift that was needed from regional employers. They're complaining, they're struggling to find people, but they weren't considering a place like Nova as part of the solution, or were discriminating against AA candidates that could otherwise do the job. And so they both were thinking about new program development, but then also working alongside the employers to say, hey, can you help us articulate what the skills you really need are? Let me show to you that our candidates can do the job. By the way, can you give them a work-based experience where they can get experience learning hands-on the actual types of tasks that you're going to need to be successful in this role? I love the research from here at the Ed School in the learning science as part of all of this, that adults actually learn best by doing. And I think you'll see in a lot of these high-tech jobs of the future that the most important thing that you need is exposure to actually using the equipment or using the programming language or being in a job setting that looks like what you're going to be doing when you finish your program. So that's something that a place like Nova or a place like Pima has done really well, is putting those types of experience at the center of their educational design. Another story in the book that has a little bit of a different trajectory, Bob mentioned, I went out to Lorain County in Northeast Ohio. This is a region that has been through a tough few decades, so looks economically very different from Northern Virginia if you zoom out and look at the income trajectory. Had a lot of jobs that have left the region, suffered from sort of globalization, trade, decline of U.S. manufacturing. But instead of just throwing their hands up and saying, well, there's nothing that we can do, the community college, and particularly I'd say that the president plays a huge role here, Marcia Ballinger, has said, we recognize that we are an anchor for this community. In fact, you heard it all across the region. We don't know where we would be without Lorain Community College. Like, thank God that the college is here. This has been sort of like the steady ship through a really challenging period for this region. And they actually took it upon themselves to talk to the employers that were still there, have small convenings with small and medium manufacturers, some of the, not the multinational corporations that had long left Ohio, but who was there and kind of sticking it out and asking them, where do you see the industry going? What's it going to take for us to get to the next, to that next level and next generation? And from that feedback, they heard about microelectronics. They started dipping their toe into what would it take for us to be the first ones in hundreds of miles of radius to set up this kind of program. And it wasn't about attracting a big employer to start. It was actually about who's right here, right now. What do they think? What kind of talent do they think is going to be needed to take them to that next level? And then they started building a program around that, getting some seed funding, and to date, it's now That program is seen as one of the national models around microelectronics training. If you talk to the folks at Lorraine, they have 100% placement rate for the people coming out of that program. Required significant upfront investment, expensive lab equipment, expensive faculty, but that kind of risk-taking mentality was then a down payment, not just for the institution, but for the whole region.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's such a great note, the importance of leadership in terms of connecting industry to academia and to community colleges. For us to thank Rachel and Bob for that first segment. And then I want to transition now to the second segment where Bob is going to engage with Kenneth. They've had a very long-standing relationship, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that on display here. I got to see a behind-the-scenes look at this, and so you're in for a treat. So, Bob, let me...
And Rachel's going to speak for me.
let me hand over the mic to you now, Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So as I mentioned before, I first met Ken working in New York. He was at the Bronx Community College. And somebody alluded to the fact that he'd had an economic development background, and I kind of sunk in a bit. But until a few days ago, when I actually Googled him and looked at his background, he didn't simply have an economic development background. He was the New York State Commissioner of Economic Development. He ran the Empire State Development Corporation. I mean, he was a major leader in that sector. So the obvious question now to ask him is, well, how do you explain your career change, which looks from the outside like a deliberate exercise in downward mobility? So what led you from those roles to the community college?
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah. I thought you'd appreciate that.
It's a great way to think about it. Hi, everybody. It's true. For a time, I was the Commissioner of Economic Development in New York State, and that meant that I gave away about $1 billion a year in tax credits and other economic incentives. Anybody here from New York? Okay, sorry about that. I was giving away your money. And at one point, I actually was authorized by the governor's office to offer $15 billion to a secret company that wanted to build a semiconductor plant in central New York. It turned out, no, not Micron, this is a while ago, it turned out to be Samsung. It was all totally secret sharing. I didn't get to give away that amount of money to attract Samsung, but that sounded kind of crazy, right? And in fact, if I had known Rachel at the time, and she had the job at the time, maybe we would have done the deal. They went to Arizona, right? Samsung plant. Texas. We lost that. But no, so seriously, after a while I said, this could feel like a race to the bottom, as some people will tell you about economics. It's a longer story for another panel. But wouldn't it be better if, this is in New York, if regions of New York State were able to compete for private sector job growth, for retaining companies, attracting companies on the basis of their workforce and on the skills level of just local residents? And wouldn't that then kind of force local education systems, public education systems and community colleges to have a seat at the table and to be part of sort of the economic revitalization of an area, not unlike what Rachel described in Lorain County, Ohio? Right? So it seemed to me that it just made better sense, and if I could figure out a way professionally to do this, that would be okay too, to work on the people side of economic development, on skills development and talent. And again, the fantasy for me is that we attract companies to New York, or Boston for that matter, not because we're giving away taxpayer dollars just to lower their costs, but because our people are smarter than the other people over there. Because that's just a good that's a competition I want to be a part of. So there was that, and there was also the second piece, I guess, is more personal, Bob, which is that when I was in that role, I had the great good fortune to work with a lot of college presidents from around New York State, because if you're in upstate New York, folks familiar with that, not unlike parts of Massachusetts, communities that it's a post-industrial upstate New York, not unlike Ohio. We talk about eds and meds, right? Educational institutions, healthcare systems are really, they sustain local employment. So we had to involve college presidents in all of our work around the state. And that, again, gave me a chance to get to know people like Ann Case, who at the time ran what was to me the best community college in New York State, which is Monroe County Community College outside of Rochester. And so just getting to see what these people were doing in various parts of the state out on Long Island gave me a personal fascination for community colleges. I became obsessed obsessed with not four-year schools, not graduate schools, not places like ours, but with community colleges for their potential to be kind of the places where lots of different types of students could get on an educational pathway, because they have community colleges have all these different kind of points of entry, right? And sometimes there are some people call them second chance schools. Well, I wanted a second chance career, so I went to, right? But the potential, when run well and with the right resources, to give people opportunities to get an educational pathway and to get the knowledge and skills that they need to really ultimately get a job and have a better life for them and their families. Like, that just is so, the mission of these institutions is so powerful to me. So on that basis as well, that it was time to get out of Albany too. Yeah. I went to the CUNY system, and I started at Bronx Community College in the Northwest Bronx, and then in 2020 went to LaGuardia, where I am now.
I want to just underscore one point that Ken made that's important in understanding the context of the book. What Ken was describing in terms of the kinds of questions that employers would ask about the skills of their workforce helps explain why we have really significant regional differences about community colleges. The community colleges in the South, by and large, came into being because you had governors that were trying to recruit companies to move south. And they said, we've got a lot of land, we'll give you tax advantages, we are mostly right-to-work states, so you don't have to worry about unions. And company leaders would say, well, all that's great, but I look at your education system, and I wonder, how are we going to get the skilled workforce we need? And it was to answer that question that smart governors in the 50s and 60s and 70s really said they created from scratch community colleges largely as workforce institutions to respond to this question about how do we get a skilled labor force. In much of the rest of the country, certainly in Massachusetts and many other states, community colleges came into being primarily to provide a low-cost first 2 years of a 4-year education. So the transfer mission really does tend in much of the country to kind of overshadow any other mission that community colleges have. So I think it's important to understand, for us at least, it's one reason, by the way, that Northern Virginia is the closest we got to a Northeast. Ideally, we would have liked to have had a community college in the Northeast to sort of balance this out instead of having two from the Southwest. But had Ann Kress stayed at Monroe, almost certainly Monroe would have been in the mix. But she moved to Nova, and that's one reason why they're there. But that's kind of context. So Ken, you now know something about this sector and what it's like. One of the reactions that we sometimes get to this book, by and large, this book has gotten very positive coverage from the industry press. But occasionally we get people who say, well, what's so different about these places? Isn't this what most community colleges do? And as I say, I think the answer differs by region. But what's your observation? You've now been at 2 community colleges in the CUNY system. You know New York State pretty well, as you've said. I mean, what's the distance between what you see in these cases and what are the kind of policy shifts in particular and funding shifts that it would take to be able to enable institutions like LaGuardia to do? I mean, you want to move in this direction. You're already doing some of these things, but what's the gap here, and what would it take to close it?
I should have done this before, Peter, but just a second on LaGuardia for a little context for everybody, and also because when we do the Q&A, this way you can poke me with questions. So LaGuardia was founded in 1971. We're in Long Island City, Queens. It's one of 7 community colleges in the CUNY system that otherwise has 12 colleges all told, including graduate schools. This is the University of New York. We have about 13,000 degree-seeking students this semester, associate degree-seeking students, and 10,000 students who are at LaGuardia not for a degree, but to learn English, to get a GED, and most of them are in our non-degree workforce training programs. That balance, Bob, by the way, is something that distinguishes LaGuardia. It makes us a little more like schools in the book, but we're very big historically on that transfer mission, like community colleges in the Northeast that have been around that long, meaning about 70% of the 13,000 degree-seeking students aspire to transfer to a 4-year or senior college in CUNY, get their baccalaureate degree. That's a good thing for them to do. But that other 30% are in our AAS, or Applied Associate of Science degree programs. Those are generally, again, 60-credit associate programs in much more, if you will, kind of technical fields like nursing and vet tech and rad tech, some of our IT programs, things like that. So Oh, and I should say, of those students, they're from, and this is Queens, so they're from 130 countries. Our students speak more than 80 heritage languages. They almost all qualify for Pell, federal financial aid, except for our undocumented students. We have to get scholarships for them because they can't get access federal or any kind of aid. They're older, like most community college students. They're older, and as Bob pointed out, most community college students work. In our case, 49% of our, or 50% say that they work. Really more do, but they don't always answer the question because they have to support their families or a loved one at home. During the pandemic, we lost a third of our students. So we're rebuilding our enrollment now. We serve the poorest students in the CUNY system because our tuition is 30% less than a four-year school. So Bob's point about a place like LaGuardia is a place to get started. Oh, and most of our students are first-gen, foreign-born, right? So as a place to get started, we're 30% cheaper. You get half of that accounting degree, and then ideally transfer to Baruch in Manhattan, finish up, take the CPA exam, and hopefully you're on your way. So we're a really important on-ramp for low-income families and for first-gen families. And because of that, there's an awful lot we have to do to support our students and help them to succeed. But from a policy standpoint, or from what's the difference between us and the rest of those schools, what they have achieved, all five of them in the book, and you used this comment, and that's, I think Peter and I sort of smiled about it, is they really have become anchor institutions. They've made themselves relevant to their communities in a way that LaGuardia, we're trying to do that, and other schools in CUNY, and we're trying to be relevant, but I think this is really important. I personally think that higher education writ large needs to reposition itself in American society, almost doesn't have a choice, right? Community colleges are very well kind of poised to do that because of our mission and because of what we do. And we have the potential to make ourselves relevant to the communities we serve. And I think you make yourself relevant by solving other people's problems. You make yourself relevant through service. And so I always talk at LaGuardia about what are we doing to double down on the second word in our name, institutionally. What problems are we solving? What are we doing for asylum seekers in New York right now? What are we doing for a whole host of issues? And how can we make ourselves relevant, especially to employers? And the schools profiled in your book have found ways to make themselves relevant to employers, and the rest is a virtuous cycle. They lift the community lifts them.
Peter, back to you for the Q&A.
Yeah, this has been phenomenal. I mean, I've been taking copious notes, as you can see here. I hope you have been as well, too. We have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. What I want to suggest is look at your tables. There's a microphone there. You press the button, and it should go green. We want to make sure that our audience is listening in can hear the questions. What we will do is take a round of 4 questions. Please keep your questions nice and succinct. Direct them to a single panelist. And then after that round goes, we will bring it to the panelists. And if we can have succinct answers, that will allow us to do a second round. So everybody is on board? Okay, so hands up. Questions? All right, so we have 1, 2 over here, 3, 4. Okay. Please say your name and then your question nice and clearly directed.
We'll start at the back and move forward. Hi, everyone. I'm Tiffany. I'm an Education Policy and Analysis Master's student here. I'm just interested, Ken, I think, mentioned earlier that, kind of the levers to success here is having good funding and good leadership in order to kind of make your community college be able to be the driver that you want. I'm curious, out of the 1,200 you said across the country, how many of the institutions are set up to actually have that?
Okay, first question. Second question. You got third, Ken. Perfect.
Hi, I'm Sifat. I'm also an education policy student here. My question is to Kenneth as well. So you mentioned that your community college serves up to 70% students are interested in a 4 years degree. So what do you say which is the key factor of the success of community colleges being the hidden economic engines? Is it just making people able to transit to 4 years college degree? So is the 4 years college degree still relevant in the economy? So are you prioritizing the 4-year college degrees, or it's just more focused on having those skills for the employers? For example, Rachel was talking about this. Can I just take?
So we're going to move on to the.
So I just want to.
We got it. See.
Okay.
So I'm going to direct that. I'll direct that question to Rachel.
Okay.
Because you
So
can
you
connect
are saying
to
that,
the
okay.
book. Siva, we're going to move on to the third question because we're short on time.
Okay. So you are saying that the community colleges have this appeal. You have to have these skills that employers need. So I don't see the link between these two. So are community colleges just upskilling and reskilling people for the employers' needs, or it's just creating a pipeline towards 4 years colleges?
Okay, thank you. Okay. And then third question. So Rachel, you will take that one. Yeah. Third question.
Hello, my name is Daniel Velasquez from Harvard Education Press. When medium-sized companies are approached in a region and are asked what type of training they want students to have, is there an expectation or an understanding that they will also fund part of these initiatives that the local college is going to kick off? Thank you.
I'll address that to Bob. And our fourth question, who's our fourth person?
Mastume from Kennedy School. I'm working on the future of the labor market. I was wondering how your experience has changed at the community college, having the experience at the state government. Like, how are you using your leverage over there here in this position?
Okay. So what we'll do is we'll start with Ken. So the two questions. So the first is on state government, community college. Kind of what have you learned between those two? And then how many colleges within the 12,000 community colleges in the U.S. are prepared for it? And then we'll move on to Rachel to talk about how important are community colleges relative to the 4-year degrees, and then Bob in terms of talking about to what extent should businesses be on the hook for helping to fund the talent pool that they want to get. So
Thank you, Peter. So my two questions. First, I'd like to think that the leadership across all of the 1,200 community colleges in this country is rock solid. I don't know. These guys know more because they met more of the leadership. But I think it is. There's certainly great potential, and there are a lot of great examples. There's an association called the American Association of Community Colleges, AACC, where all of us will be meeting in Kentucky in a couple of weeks. And it's a really dedicated, impressive group of leaders. The second piece of your question is more the money, and that's harder. It goes state by state, region by region. Usually there's not enough money because we want to keep our tuition low and make this education affordable to low-income and working-class people, and we need to find ways to subsidize it. I don't have time to talk about workforce Pell, but the legislation failed to make it to the floor for a House vote. It was supposed to on Thursday. It's awful that it didn't get to a vote. The legislation as it is now is perfect. It's good enough, and it should have happened. So this is a failure of, well, I said I wouldn't get into it, so I won't. But there are solutions within reach here, like this would have made, in a very limited way, federal programs available for low-income students seeking workforce training, not a degree. Remember that because of our obsession with 4-year degrees, with baccalaureate degrees in this country historically, our financial aid systems at the state level, when a state has financial aid for college, and certainly Pell, right, the federal system, it always rewards degree attainment, i.e. the baccalaureate, leaving precious little, if anything, for training people for skills for today's economy. It's a glaring omission in education funding in the country. And we were so close last week. I'm still crazy over this, Peter, because it didn't. It was. We were going to get a floor vote, and it got pulled. The NEA, the Teachers Association. I will say this on the record. The opponents to this are national. You can imagine who they are. Yes. So the second question was the second one that came after the first one.
This was like thinking about like would you state
Oh yeah. So it's great to move. Any of you work in government, and Rachel worked in government. She's gone back and forth. It's great to go back and forth. We need to pull more people out of government into community colleges. I like big, complicated organizations. We have $200 million budget, a couple thousand people, everybody's unionized except for 22 of us. And it's really fun. I go to work every day, and the whole thing is, if you want a job where you have to solve problems, but you do it in a system, so a little solution can solve a problem at scale, my dream is you do something, you help a lot of people. Because these are big, complicated systems. But my experience in state government helped me prepare for that.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Kenneth. Rachel.
I don't think the takeaway from the book is that you need to pick, are you training for employers or you have BAs? If you read the book, I hope that's not your takeaway, because that's not the message of the colleges and their stories. In fact, it's one of the reasons, Bob, I think one thing was missed in the case selection is we were looking for schools that do both, that yes, our focus, when you poll students coming into community college about why they're enrolling, getting a pathway to a better paying job for their family and for their future is a number one motivating factor. And that's true whether you enroll in a 8-week certification program that might be more narrowly focused on a particular occupation, or if you are hoping to transfer and go onwards and get a PhD. So one of the things I think we highlight is the ways that colleges are thinking about putting things like, what are the basic career skills that you need to navigate figuring out how I get from where I am now to the job that I actually want, embedding that into the curriculum, not just having like a career center over here that's for the people who have time to partake in those services, but instead making it central to every course, whether that be an English course or a welding course. So I guess I would like reject the frame of the question that you have to choose one or the other, but I do think that yes, like the higher education system in the US was not necessarily built to think about jobs as the end point here, and we don't think it's the end point either, by the way. You have to move in between the labor market and the economy, and we see people constantly needing to retool and reshift. And so the colleges that are set up the best have put what the students want at the center of everything they're doing, irrespective of the program. So I'll say one more word on the funding model, which is a little plug for the book that we do have in the final chapter, sort of a summary of some of the types of funding solutions. None of them are going to be a Band-Aid for every problem, but at least particularly focus on this question of how do you get colleges to embrace the economic mobility mission as part of their core mission. What are the funding vehicles that might help you get there, and talks a little bit about the pros and cons of the different options.
Can I speak in a footnote? Because you asked the question, and I want to add to Rachel exactly what Rachel's saying. But just practically speaking at LaGuardia, it's about a balance. Right? There's this tension between academic mission and a workforce mission, which is kind of alluded to in the book. So it's about finding a balance that's right for students. My sense is often in education, we give students what they think they want instead of asking what do they want. And so we want to give at LaGuardia, we want to give students what they want, not what we think they ought to have. Right? And so the balance, it's about a balance.
3 pieces of data before I answer the question.
Can I say just a quick tag on to Rachel's response to Sifat's point? There has been a movement in the U.S. labor market where about 18 states have removed their degree requirements, and also the federal government has passed an executive action saying that it would hire based on skills and not degrees. And my colleagues at Opportunity at Work in Washington, D.C. and I have been doing a lot of research that's been at the forefront of this in concert with work that our colleague Joe Fuller's been doing too, in terms of repositioning how employers think about workers without bachelor's degrees. Thinking about them as being skilled through alternative routes. They might have an associate's degree from a community college. They might be a veteran. They might have gained that experience through their relevant work. And so there's a ton of movement. And in fact, one of the big proponents of this recently joined the Harvard Corporation, Kenneth Fraser, who's at Merck. His company was one of the 70 companies that created the 110 initiative that has committed to hiring workers who are skilled through alternative routes or STARS over the next 10 years. So there's been a lot of movement. It's not college but it's having multiple pathways. And that's a great setup for Bob, who's thought a lot about multiple pathways, to tell us a bit about what role should businesses play in terms of paying for the talent that they want to get trained through community colleges.
Yeah, before I answer that, 3 quick data points I wanted to put on the table. One is, this picks up on one of Rachel's comments. 80% of young people who enroll in community colleges say that they're to get a 4-year degree. 6 years later, it's about 14%. So think about that. So to me, one conclusion from that is community colleges really ought to focus hard on making sure that anybody who goes out the door has something of value in the labor market. Over 40% of the degrees are in liberal arts general studies. Those degrees, unless they're followed to completion by a 4-year degree, have very little value in the labor market. Second statistic, brand new from one of our colleagues, Matt Sigelman, new report from Strata and Burning Glass Institute. 52% of young 4-year degree holders are working in jobs that didn't really require a 4-year degree. And the sad part of that is 10 years later, 3/4 of those people are still in jobs that didn't really require a 4-year degree. I Again, think about the implications of that. Says something about the need to really focus much more in four-year institutions as well as two-year institutions on careers and workforce and preparing students. One of the things our colleges, the colleges that we profile do and do well, is they all rely very heavily on real-time labor market information. They make that information available to their students early on so that student choices of majors are at least guided by information about what the labor market opportunities are in your region. The third point comes back to the dollar question. A couple of years ago, the Center for American Progress did a national study of the funding gap between community colleges and four-year institutions in their states. The bottom line number was $78 billion, something like $7,800 or $8,000 per student, per revenue per student, between community college students, what they get, and what four-year students get. Remember, half of the Latino students in the country who are in post-secondary education are in community colleges. 40% of African-American students in post-secondary education are in community colleges. So if you bring an equity lens, this is the one reason why dealing frontally with the funding issue is so important. But let me tie that to the answer to the question about how these institutions work with employers. One huge benefit, and you'll see this most clearly in the San Jacinto case in Texas, of starting with employers as they begin to build their programs, is then employers have buy-in, and employers then participate in the funding of new facilities, sometimes in the loan of folks from industry to deal with some of the shortfalls in faculty who don't have the skills from companies. So there's a huge economic benefit to companies in starting that way. Just one small footnote again on the Nova case that Rachel alluded to. Ann Kress, the president there, closed down a very popular program in hospitality. Why? Because she looked at the wages that students were graduating to and said, sorry, this is not worth our investment if companies are not going to pay people living wages. And she very typically, when employers approach her about launching short-term programs, will ask that question, what are you going to pay? At Nova, every company that's represented by someone who sits on an advisory committee has to commit to that company interviewing students in that field. They don't commit to making a job offer, but they commit to at least providing interviews. In other words, these community colleges are smart about negotiating with their employer communities. Once they've built trust and once they've built them in as really co-partners and co-designers, then they can make asks that other community colleges may find it harder to do.
Can I say one more word about the San Jacinto case?
In 20 seconds.
20 seconds. I'll just use a word that I really like, which is incubator. And they have focused on using the non-credit side of the house, which is, for those of you who know higher ed, a little more flexible. You can try some stuff that you might not have been able to do in a 4-credit program initially, and it's easier to get the employers in the door in this co-creation function that Bob mentioned. And then what they've done, though, is actually transition programs like maritime, like aerospace, with employer buy-in, with good hiring results. They look at it and said, yes, this is working. And then they go through the process of getting those courses accredited so that they can move into transfer pathways and connect to other programs. So I do think that this part of like how easy is it to start something new is a relevant question for employers, and you need some models that can be a little more flexible to get things going quickly, but also to look critically at what are the outcomes that this program is actually leading to.
And 20 seconds for Kenneth to say, what are the opportunities for students in this room who are looking for jobs at LaGuardia Community College?
Peter, thank you. Okay.
Y'all looking for jobs, right? Who's looking for jobs?
Visit our website. No, CUNY's a big system, 40,000 people. Someone's always retiring. Someone's always leaving. There's always jobs. On a practical basis, places like LaGuardia need people to help build and manage those relationships with employers, like the mid-sized company from which we want to get internships and so on. We need people to connect people in basically our academic departments. We have 60 more majors and 9 departments. And there's a constant scrubbing of the curriculum to make sure it's relevant and that we're teaching, tomorrow's, if not today's, competencies to the students in those programs. Bottom line is our faculty, our 375 full-time faculty, phenomenal, great people dedicated to teaching, and our 450 adjuncts the same. But they cannot, with the demands on their workload, they can't make those connections to the communities around LaGuardia, to work with employers, public and private, to work with all the systems in New York City, to maintain that relevance and to stay ahead of the curve. So we need that kind of help, Peter. And we always need there's lots of other things I could think of, but we welcome, I've taken wonderful people from Columbia, NYU. Actually, we have Harvard Business School alumni do free consulting for us, but that's the club down in New York City. But for you all, absolutely.
So we will
love to have you.
We'll definitely advertise the jobs. And I want to give Carrie McKittrick, who's one of our co-executive directors of the Harvard Project on Workforce, an opportunity to make an announcement.
Thank you. I'll be super quick because I know you all have places to go. But I want to just share that advancing community colleges and highlighting the work they're doing continues to be a priority for the Project on Workforce. And we just launched a new project with support actually from Stephanie at Axum. It's a research and design project with the Education Design Lab. We're going to be studying community colleges that are using labor market information, new technologies in innovative ways. There are going to be full-time researcher positions, short-term, available starting in August. You'll hear more information about that in the coming weeks. But all of you who are passionate about the topic, please stay tuned. We would love to involve you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And Allie will be selling books in the corner.
Okay. That's right, books. Get your books. So please join me in thanking our terrific panelists, Bob Schwartz, Rachel Lipson, Kenneth Adams. I think they're going to hang out for a little bit, so if you have questions that you wanted to ask, please feel free to come up here and chat a little bit more with them. And Kenneth, again, thank you again. Welcome to Harvard. Welcome back, Rachel. So good to have you. And Bob, always a pleasure. And thank you so much for spending precious time with us. It's been an absolute joy and a pleasure. Please come up, chat with our panelists, and purchase a book. Thank you so much.